Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar with our journey through Peru with Dr. Fabián Michelangeli. Hopefully I said that properly. We appreciate everybody joining us for this wonderful webinar as we celebrate Fiesta de Flores in honor of Hispanic Heritage Month. And without further ado, if I did not, no, I just going to start the presentation, and please enter any questions you may have in the chat function of the webinar, and we will answer them and have a conversation with Dr. Michelangeli after the presentation. So thank you very much. One second.
Hi, my name is Fabián Michelangeli, and I'm a curator in science here at the New Botanical Garden. I'm originally from Caracas, Venezuela, where I studied biology for my undergrad, and then I came to the US to obtain my PhD in botany. It's an honor today to represent my garden colleagues for this Fiesta de Flores celebration, especially because the garden has a very long history of research in biodiversity in Latin America. In fact, our founders did some of their very first expeditions over 120 years ago to Cuba and Puerto Rico, and garden scientists have kept working in Latin America ever since. Not only that, if you go today to many universities, museums, and government institutions in Latin America, our colleagues there have gotten their training here at the New York Botanical Garden. This short video that we're about to show you shows a small glimpse of what is to do field work, in this particular case, work that I'm conducting in Peru. I hope it gives you a flavor of the hard work that takes to document biodiversity. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Fabián Michelangeli, one of the scientists at the New York Botanical Garden. And here we are in Lima, waiting to depart to the Andes, where tonight we'll be traveling by bus for 11 hours deep into the cloud forest, where we expect to work for the next 12 days looking at the biodiversity, one of these very interesting places, the Yanachaga-Chemillén National Park. Western Cordillera. We're going to be over 14,000 feet. And then we go down to the Interandean valleys, and then we're going to go up to the eastern, into a valley into the Eastern Cordillera, back up to about 5,000 feet. Yesterday we spent the day in the herbarium, and we were looking at different collections in different localities, and now we have some good ideas of where we can find some interesting and potentially maybe even new things. And we're gonna go find the first of these localities. It's raining a lot, so it might not be the best day to collect, but we push through.
one of the things of working in these areas is that I have a global perspective. Like I have seen the plants that I work with all the way from Cuba to Argentina. But I don't know the individual species or where they are exactly. And that's the advantage of working with local people, is that they might not have the global perspective, but they know the ecology, know where the plants are, and they know the individual species. So it's a partnership all the time. And that's why I enjoy being here and teaching them, and they teach me. You never stop learning. We're hoping to climb up to about 10, 11,000 feet, so it's over a 3,000 feet climb today. Very different environment from yesterday, and hopefully we'll get another good set of plants.
Why do you do this?
Why do I do this? Because I'm insane. But I do this, I hike all of this, and I have bad food, and I get tired because I want to learn about biodiversity. I want to understand how organisms interact and why they are here, why not. Broader impact is that we can only manage what we understand. And if we don't understand our environment, how are we going to manage it or even take advantage of it? Parting words. I hope that this exercise will serve to illustrate and make you understand a little bit of the behind the scenes work that it takes to understand biodiversity, to understand our planet, to understand our resources. And it starts from very basic knowledge of where the plants are and which are the plants that are in one place, and when they bloom, when they fruit, how common they are. And unless you do this type of hard work, you don't get that data. I just got stung or bitten. I don't know what the technical term would be in this case, by this mini tarantula here.
Dangers of the field.
So, hi. That's very short, but I hope it gives you an idea. So, any field work, how, I want to highlight a few things there is, how isolated some of these areas are. The second, and probably one of the most important things, is that we always work with local people. We train students, we work in partnerships, they are co-PIs on our grants. That means they're like active participants on the grants. And so it's not, in the old days, when somebody went from here to Latin America, they just went, or they just came. And in fact, I met many people 30, 40 years ago that way when I was a child in Venezuela. But now we can't do that, and we don't do that. So we always work with local people. And then the other thing is that you never know what the conditions will be, and then you have to hope for the best, but always prepare for the worst. So I'm gonna start asking some questions as they come in. Please go ahead and put them there in the chat. So one of the questions is about the damage. The first question was, what was the status of El Yunque in Puerto Rico? So there's a mountain for those of you who don't know, in the easternmost part of Puerto Rico called El Yunque, and it has a cloud forest, not unlike the one I was in Peru. And it got a lot of damage during Hurricane Maria, and mostly, there's downing of trees, but also then landslides with the rain and all that. So fortunately, Puerto Rico is an area that has lots of hurricanes. So a lot of the plants, a lot of the forest is adapted to withstand that type of pressure. And also anytime there is some amount of damage, that creates gaps that allow some species that don't like the deep part of the forest, but are, their seeds are dormant or there to come and recover and then start a process that might take dozens or even hundreds of years to get back to a mature forest. So that's what's happening in El Yunque. One of the problems is that when you make those gaps, you also have opportunities for invasive species to come in. And that's something that some of my colleagues I know at the University of Puerto Rico and then DEP Puerto Rico are actively working to monitor just to see whether or not that's happening. So the damage might be very visually striking, but it's a lot less that, let's say, it had been a forest that had destroyed entire forest, a fire that had destroyed the entire forest. So here is it's a little bit different. So the next question is, if I need special permits to bring specimens back into the US, and what are the steps that we take to make sure that none of these are released into our environment. So many things happen first. Yes, you need permits, and you need several different permits. We need permits to conduct, we need a general permit to do any research study in any country. And then we need specific permits for the particular trip. So in this case, we have a permit to work in Peru, and then we had a permit to work on that national park. Once we collect all the plants, then we need to get local authorization to move the plants from where they were collected to the city of Lima. Then they are processed there. And in that processing, the plants are pressed, dried, and that actually kills them. So then we deposit half of whatever we collect in country, in this case Lima, but it might well be the National Herbarium in Havana, or it can be the herbarium of the University of Puerto Rico if we're working in Puerto Rico, or in Santo Domingo is a Moscoso Botanical Garden. And then with that, then we go to the government, the local government, and ask for an export permit. And then with that, we bring them into the US with an import permit from the USDA. And we have to declare that when we go through customs. So there is a lot of permits that are involved. So I particularly I'm not collecting live plants. So I'm not collecting cuttings. I do collect seeds for anatomical studies and evolutionary studies, but those seeds are killed before we bring them in. So nothing that we bring in can cause issues. If we were working with live plants, then there's a whole other procedure where you have to certify that you have the laboratory facilities or the greenhouse facilities where that cannot escape. I hope that answers that question. Somebody asked how the local politics affect our ability to continue collect. For example, Bolsonaro in Brazil. Well, that's a great question, and it's very complicated, and it's not always what you expect. So in some cases, they are for all these permits and all these things. They are both international regulations that are put through the Nagoya Protocol, through the CITES, which is permits that regulate how you move species that have any commercial value, which fortunately for me is not my case, but if you were on orchids or cacti or bromeliads, that would be the case. And then, so besides those international agreements, then that change with time, then there are the local conditions. So for example, specifically with Bolsonaro, part of the problem is that since he took office, all the permits to export plants from Brazil have sort of frozen. So while we can continue to work in Brazil, and in fact, I've been to Brazil since Bolsonaro has been president, probably three different expeditions, all my samples are still in Brazil. I haven't been able to bring anything down because it's not that he says that they cannot be exported, it's just that nothing has happened. There are regulations within the Ministry of the Environment in Brazil, the Instituto Chico Mendes, so that, those are some issues. So yes, we always have to take into account the local conditions. And that's one of the reasons a good reason, not the reason, why it's good to work with local, faculty, students, and all of that is because they help you navigate all the local things. Other things are out of your control. So for example, this area in Peru where we did this video is in an area that was not very accessible in the 80s because of guerrilla problems, safety, etc. But then that changed and then it opened it up. There are many areas of Colombia that had not been easy for scientists to get to due to the guerrilla and drug traffic. But then as situations have improved in the last 10 years, then some of those areas started to open up. And then as situations have started to worsen in other areas have closed. So you always have to be aware of those things. And then something as small as a small strike of, let's say, potato farmers, which happened to me in Bolivia once. They closed the road because the price of the potato at, in the bulk price was too low and they were protesting. They closed the road and I was basically trapped between two roadblocks for 3 days. We took advantage of it. We collected in that area, but those are things that always happen.
People are asking, there's a couple similar questions about the types of plants and the family of plants, specifically of the ones in Peru and the ones that you were researching in Peru. So maybe share about that in particular.
Well, I'm gonna share one thing. Somebody asked about that spider bite or sting or whatever it was.
There's concern about that.
I tell you, it was very interesting. I felt like I had been hit with a baseball bat in the back of my neck. It was one of the most horrible pains, but it only lasted about 5 seconds, no more than that. And then 1 minute later, I was totally fine. It never swelled up, anything. And then like 3 days later, my ear got very swollen. So I had a delayed reaction there. And Marlon, who was shooting this footage, who's one of our colleagues here at the garden, doesn't like spiders very much. So he was very glad that I got stung and not him. So that happened. So now the serious part, not that getting stung by a spider is not serious, but so I work mostly with the princess flower family. This is a family that has about 5,700 species, mostly in the tropics. They are known as princess flowers, and here in the Northeast, we have actually 2 species that make it all the way here. One of them they are the meadow beauties, and they're small little herbs that, or sort of shrubby things that are at the edge of cranberry bugs or other acidic bugs. In fact, we have one growing in our native plant garden here, and it's right now in fruit. I just went through the native plant garden this morning, and you can see it right now here at the garden, right by where the carnivorous plants are. So that's the family. But then if you get to Florida, we have about 10 species in Florida, and then you go to Cuba, and there are 190 species of this family in Cuba. There's about 1,000 of them in Colombia, about 1,300 in Brazil, about 700 in Peru. So there is a very diverse family, and they grow anywhere that is wet. About half the species, a little bit more than half the species have berries, and a little bit less than half have dry capsular fruits. And the ones that have berries are like favorite food for most birds. So they're great garden plants for people that have bird feeders and stuff in Latin America. So and not in my current project, but a previous project that I have that lasted for 9 years, my colleagues and I described 127 new species for this plant family from Latin America. So we basically took it from 3,500 species to almost 3,700 species in this just one project. And that sort of tells you how much is left to do. That particular national park in Peru, we have described 13 new species from that park in the last 5 years, including 2 that came out just literally last week in Britonia, the garden journal. Let's see other questions here. There's a question, have I witnessed any marked changes because of climate change over the years? Well, marked changes are hard to see, especially if you talk in a 5-year period or 10-year period. But fortunately, there are some places there's a place in Costa Rica and there's a place in Peru that I have worked, and another one in Brazil, actually 3 places, where there were forest inventories done about 40 years ago. And now I have colleagues and friends that have done forest inventories in the very same plots 30, 25, 40 years later. And then we can really measure what the change is. And one of the interesting things is that in some cases, it seems that the plants have really changed. So if you know Schefflera, this house plant, there's a member of that family that we have seen in the Andes every year gets higher. And it's something that is like you can see it, plants that were not there one year, they're there now. But they have a quick, even though they're treelets, they have a quick reproductive cycle. Then there are other plants, it takes a long time for a plant to move. The one plant doesn't move, it's their offspring that moves. And that takes a lot longer to see. So we do see changes, but how marked they are or not, it depends on the time scale we're talking about. So somebody asked if I do anything that has to do plant-based medicine. I don't do that. I have colleagues here at the garden. For example, Ina Vanderbroek does that. Mike Bailey does some of that work. And some of it has been done in the very same areas that I've been to in Latin America, be it Peru or Costa Rica, or Ina and I actually have been to the very same places in the Dominican Republic, the same people. But no, my research doesn't intersect a lot with that. You would have to ask my colleagues to get a better story on that. Actually, Ina's research is particularly timely for today, Fiesta de Flores, because it's not only about plant-based medicines in Latin America, especially in the Caribbean, but how those communities here in New York City, particularly in the Bronx and northern Manhattan, have moved those plant-based medicines practices from the Caribbean to the Bronx, Queens, and New York City, and what are the differences and what are the similarities, and what happens when you bring Dominican culture and Puerto Rican culture and Jamaican culture all together, and it's very, very interesting things. What do I consider one of the most beautiful places? Ooh, I like so many of them, but I am very partial to these mountains in northern Amazonia, the Guayana Shield. So they are in eastern Colombia, all of southern Venezuela, and then through the Guyanas. So these mountains are like this sheer tops, and they're not as high as the Andes, but the geology is very striking, and the proportion of endemisms is really, really high. Any of one of these mountain tops, 50% of the species. So half of the species that you see are endemic. So that's, the Guayana Shield is my favorite. I do love the Andes in general, but I'm an equal opportunity offender. I will travel anywhere. I travel to places that my plants don't grow in, just because I love nature in general. And have I ever studied in Asia? And well, I haven't ever studied in Asia for a variety of reasons, partly because the group that I work in is most diverse in Latin America, and others is because I have very close colleagues that I work with at different institutions. I have a colleague at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. I have a colleague at the California Academy of Sciences, and another colleague the Botanical Research Institute of Texas, all who have worked in Vietnam, China, the Philippines. And so then we work in the same group of plants, and then we exchange samples, and then we exchange knowledge. And no one person can be everywhere. So we have sort of divided and conquered this way to understand this group of plants across the the globe. So somebody is asking, what is the botanical name of the princess flower? So the family is Melastomataceae. Melastomataceae. So that means Melas means black and stoma means mouth. So it's a black mouth family. And I mentioned earlier, they have berries. Many of them have berries. And then you eat them, you will get your tongue really, they're very sweet. They're a little bit like a blueberry. And you get your tongue like purple, dark, and they're nice. It goes away. I mean, it's water. I mean, glass of water and then the color goes away. But yeah, Melastomataceae. Then the particular genus of meadow beauties here in the US is Rhexia. That is Rhexia. And then the princess flower itself, what we call princess flower, there are two genera that are princess flower. One is Tibucina and the other one is Pleroma. What we call princess flowers are from Brazil, those particular ones. So the Peruvian national parks include the area of Machu Picchu. So Machu Picchu, there are many different national parks in Peru. And they have, like in the US, we have national parks, we have state parks, and we have like national forests and national monuments. And Peru has a similar system in which there are different degrees of protection and different designations. And Machu Picchu itself is actually a designation that not only includes, is preserved not only for its cultural, nature importance, but also by the cultural importance. So it's both, because it's not only preserving nature, but you also have to preserve that, the cultural legacy of the places. So yes, Machu Picchu is preserved, but in a different, not as a national park, but even a more stringent category.
Fabian, a question came through also in the Q&A about, have any of our botanical co-workers been able to verify and follow up on their research at Inca Agricultural Laboratory in Moray near Cusco, if I say that right?
Yeah. So for those of that don't know, this place called Moray, it's all Inca site is beautiful. I've been there, and it's basically two inverted two funnels, basically terraces all the way down. And because of how they are, there's the difference in microclimates is very marked between the top terraces and the bottom terraces. So it's in about 20 or 30 terraces, you can have more differences in temperature that you would have in the whole hillside in the more exposed part of the valley. So what that allow them, some people think, is to have different types of cultivars at different terraces and see which ones did better under different conditions. No, actually, I don't work in my colleagues and I here we don't work a lot on cultivated plants. That's actually changing. We just hired our newest curator, Alex McAvey, who just started 3 weeks ago here at the garden. He does work in the origin of cultivated plants and the evolution of cultivated plants. He hasn't worked particularly in Peru. He's worked in Mexico. He's worked in the Pacific Northwest. He's worked in Ethiopia, but not yet in Peru. Somebody's asking is how are our trips funded? Very good question. Well, first thing is by you. So donate. No, in all seriousness, they come from a variety of sources. In my particular case, most of my projects are funded through the National Science Foundation. So I write projects that have a component that is a field component, and that's how we fund the trips. And the trips are not, they have a purpose. Why do we want to go to this place or that place? That's all, very specific to the proposal. Unfortunately, there are some areas like Cuba where I cannot use federal money. So for federal money, we do rely on private donations and private foundations. And then we have to, nature doesn't know political borders. And as I mentioned, Florida has only 10 species, but Cuba has 200 in this group of plants that I work with. 160 of those 200 are endemic to Cuba. So it's a significant proportion, and we need to get there to understand these things. So to be able to work there, we rely on private donors. And the accounting is a nightmare because there's something the US has a lot of controls on how you can spend money in Cuba. And so we have to obey by all of that.
So some other questions that came in on the Q&A about is logging or other development moving plants more quickly to new habitats, not just destroying them? Could this be perverse preservation?
I didn't see that one yet. I mean, I'm looking.
No, it came in through the Q&A side.
So okay. Let me. I don't see. Well, so logging is an issue, and you know, the same way that I mentioned that a hurricane can open a new habitat in El Yunque in Puerto Rico, logging can open new habitats. But the problem with logging is that the scale is much bigger, and then that place is not left alone. That place then gets, you know, cows go in, or agriculture goes in, or fire goes in. So logging is an issue in many places, and it depends where you are. The scale and the reasons are different. So for example, if you are in certain areas of Bahia in Brazil, there was a lot of logging there in the 50s and 60s that was done to then open areas to plant other trees, to plant eucalyptus, to plant pine, these things for paper production and for wood, just for wood. So yes, it was logging, and that was at a massive scale. When you see logging in many places in Peru, for example, or even in Puerto Rico, is not so much for the wood, but is to open areas for cattle ranching. So that the reasons can vary from place to place, and the scale varies from time to time. So in places like Costa Rica and Cuba that have very strong legislation and a good national park system, the areas that are parks are well protected from logging, but the areas that are not park then are open for logging. So in a place like Peru, the parks sometimes are not as well protected, so logging does encroach into the park, but it's a much bigger country, so people don't get into every area and don't get into areas that are not parks. So it varies. Somebody asked, where do I work in Costa Rica? Costa Rica is one of the countries I have visited the most, not so much for research, but for teaching. I teach a class there every other year, and we go to 4 different biological stations, literally in the 4 corners of the country, to be able to show the students. These are master's and PhD students in forestry, Yale University, one of our partners institutions for our graduate program. And we go to, you know, cloud forest, lowland forest, dry forest, and mangrove areas, so that we really go all over the country. Somebody says that I explore a lot of mountainous areas, and have I seen any similarities in widely separated areas? So yes, I mean, there are some ecological things that you see everywhere. As you go higher in the mountain, plants get smaller. Plants get, the leaves get smaller, the leaves get tougher. On average, no, if you look at any one species, that might not be the case, but on average, that tends to happen. And then I'm actually collaborating with some colleagues in the University of Vienna right now, and we're looking how their apparel changes also, not only in these characteristics of the leaves of the plants and stuff, but on how the plants are pollinated. So in the Prince's family in Melastomataceae, at lowlands, almost everything is bee pollinated. But as you go up, whether you are in Central America, the Andes, or in or Eastern Brazil, then you have a switch to other pollinators from bees to kind of be birds, bats, butterflies, and a host of things. And we see this in different places. And the explanation is that as you go up, there are fewer bees, both in number and number of species and number of individuals. So plants have adapted to other things. Somebody said that they see that had on the cover of National Geographic, meaning my neurobotanical hat. I know who is asking this question. I hope he's playing his cello right now. It wasn't the cover, but yes, it was in National Geographic on an article. Everywhere I go, this neurobotanical garden hats are very well priced by my colleagues. So it's, we give them there.
Somebody asked about your education, where you were educated, what your background was, if you could share.
Yeah, so I am originally from Venezuela, and I studied biology in Caracas at Universidad Central de Venezuela. And then after I got my undergrad there, I taught a year of high school. And then I decided that even though I love teaching, I needed to teach a little bit older people. And I came to the US, I came to Cornell University, where I did my PhD in botany. So about 5 hours from here, from near Botanical Garden. And then I moved to New York City, and I was actually a postdoc at the American Museum of Natural History for almost 3 years before I came here to the garden 17 years ago now. Other questions you see there?
There was one question about, have you and your colleagues noticed increased poaching with the rising interest in rare houseplants? And that's, yes, with the plant mania. That's interesting.
Yes. And, you know, we see a lot of it, and we see a lot of it on the internet too. Sometimes I want to say, oh, I don't have a picture of this plant, and I just Google the name, and immediately somebody's selling it. And these are plants that are rare. You know, I have a colleague that described a palm species from a place in Colombia, and they actually purposely did not give the precise locality because they were concerned about poaching. And within 3 months, the plant was being sold in the internet. And these weren't seedlings, they were selling like live plants. So they had gone to this place in Colombia and taken the whole plants out. So we do see that. You know, sometimes you hope that if somebody can take 1 or 2 individuals out and they can propagate them in their homes and their greenhouses, that's a lot easier than going to these places. And then even though they were taken illegally, that can somehow put less pressure on it, but I don't think that that's the case. I think that actually creates more of a market for these things and creates more of an awareness of these rare things. And, you know, 50 years ago, people collected orchids, and some people collected cacti. And now there are people that are getting into collecting these very rare, like families, like things in that you would never expect that they would have such a following. So within Melastomataceae, there are two genera, one from the Atlantic rainforest in Brazil and one from the Andes. These are Bertollonia and Triolena that I've seen, I don't know, probably half of the species of each genus now are being sold in the black market. And in fact, one of my students described last year or 2 years ago, a species that we found the first time in a greenhouse, not in nature. So that tells you what's happening. And then we went after the plant and found it in nature. Because once we knew who was doing the commercial part, we could figure it out. Any pictures? Let's see if I can find a few things here, but that actually I should have prepared that.
We have stuff on the website for sure.
Yes.
There's stuff at nybg.org in the Plant Research and Conservation section. There was a question that just came in about, are there opportunities for non-professionals to participate in field work or join tours that focus on native plant populations?
Yeah. So it's the garden in the past had tours for people like nature lovers. It got a little bit complicated to organize these tours, and especially because some places then you need special permits, and because our time in those places is not a lot, so then we prefer to do research. There is talk to reopening this tours, and hopefully, yeah. And then as far as like more volunteer work to work with native plant populations, I think the best choice there is to go directly through local NGOs that are in site, are in that country. So either Brazil or Costa Rica or Puerto Rico or Jamaica, and to work with them directly in place than necessarily with us. But just because I think that there's a lot to be said for leaving your stuff locally.
I just put the link for the plant research and conservation for all of the programs, not specifically the ones directly to yours, but just so that people can go and you can look at all of our various amazing science programs and research that they're doing all across the globe. Don't have a specific picture of your particular plant, but I know there's stuff in there. So I think
I should. I mean, the problem is that if I go through that there now on my computer, I cannot multitask. Any other? How has the global pandemic affected your travel and research? Great question. Severely. We are not allowed to travel. So I was literally about to go to Cuba in mid-March when we canceled the trip. Literally the day before. I was going there on March 17th. So since then, I have canceled a trip to Southern Florida, a trip to Cuba, a trip to Brazil, and a trip to Peru. So between March and now, in this 6 months, I would have gone to those four field trips. There's something, it's not only that we cannot, that there are no flights and all that, but let's say they open the airports tomorrow. I think it would be a little bit irresponsible on my part, unethical, to show up in the middle of a forest in Ecuador or Bolivia or whatever, and maybe bring my diseases from New York City to places that already have issues with healthcare. So I think there will be a little while before we can go back into the field, but it's a problem. One thing that hasn't stopped is the rate of fires in the Amazon and deforestation and so forth. And actually, my colleague Douglas Daly published just this week in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science an opinion piece specifically about this. So it's open access in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and I think the title is something like, pandemic has stopped traveling, but deforestation hasn't. And that's something.
Just posted it on our social media and our read and watch section, which I just included as a link in the chat function for anybody else who wants to also read about that, because it's a wonderful piece.
Yeah. So
I didn't mean to cut you off, but I also don't want to keep you too long because we're at 1:45. So I think we're good. And we got some wonderful questions, and this was fantastic. Always wonderful. We want to thank you for speaking to everybody, and thank everybody for coming out and listening, and loved your plug to donate, because yes, we'll get you to go on trips when we can go back and travel.
We'll go soon.
Thank
it will happen.
For doing this for Fiesta. This was wonderful to hear about this and to hear about all the stuff that you're doing in Latin America and the countries.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Feel free to contact us through the garden channels, and we can answer questions if you want, or we can have another event like this.
Yes, please follow along, follow us on social media, check out the links we put in the chat. Fabián is always doing wonderful events. We love to follow him around and bring cameras to go on his trips with him when he lets us and see what he's doing. So really appreciate everybody from joining us. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
My pleasure.